and she spent most of her time living in Laos and Nepal. Sarah brings a wealth of knowledge on her research topics on agricultural contributions to the food system, sustainable groundwater management, and climate change adaptation and mitigation. Please also join me in welcoming our speakers for today. Let me introduce Caroline Turner. Caroline has joined us from FAO office, regional office, and she's our program manager for AWP DFED funded program on next generation irrigation program, working in the land and water team. So Caroline will cover today and will get us thinking hard why the Nexus approach should be considered broader than water, food, energy, especially in transboundary contexts. She'll also share with us advantages and real challenges to implementing Nexus approaches at the national and transboundary level. Next, please welcome Federico Davila, doctor, from the University of Technology, Sydney. And he's an interdisciplinary social scientist on food system research. Dr. Davila will bring to this discussion on the interesting topic of consideration of human energy and gendered roles of the Nexus in the Pacific, data alignment in water, agriculture, energy and human, community governance, coexistence, and working with local partners and workings with knowledge gap. Welcome the speakers. And joining us today online also, please welcome Dharavi here. She's been working on the largest Australian funded program in Cambodia on agricultural value chain. And she will bring her wealth of knowledge and experience with her on the discussion about how to improve the farmers' income, irrigation impact on farmers, sustainable irrigation system, and stakeholder engagement. So without any further ado, the floor is yours, Tamara.
Thanks, Van, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. As Van said, I'm Tamara Jackson, and I'm really excited to be here today. I've been working on elements of the Nexus since I started my PhD in 2006. And as Caroline and I were just discussing earlier, all it seems to do is keep raising questions. But for that reason, I think it's really it's exciting, it's important, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your experiences and learning from you all today. So the water, food, energy nexus is a key concept. I think we could all agree. It expresses the importance of integrated thinking, but it can be abstract when we think about how it can be applied on the ground. So the aim of this session is to really get people thinking about how to operationalize the nexus. So how do we take the concept of the water, food, energy nexus, or whatever the nexus we define, and apply it in water-focused development interventions in a practical way? And I wanted to first highlight three issues regarding the nexus from the start before I pass on to my colleagues, and give some examples from previous work in South Asia, and three corresponding challenges that I would like you to also consider as we go through the session. So I think the first, I guess I'm calling it an elephant in the room, is that the nexus is an abstract concept. And I think sometimes we can be flippant that maybe it's a fad or it's a phrase that we throw about without meaning. Sorry, I don't know what I've done there. I don't need the slide. This is Caroline's slide. Yeah. But really it's about connections, and it's promoted so that we can encourage a more holistic perspective on development, particularly around natural resources, and it can help emphasize the interdependence between different resources and address synergies and trade-offs among their use. So for the past 4 years, I've been working with the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research to manage their part of the Sustainable Development Investment Portfolio, ACRSDIP, a DFAT funded portfolio that aimed to improve food, energy and water management in South Asia. And I can absolutely confess that it was not always easy to explain the nexus or why we should be working at that level to different people that the program had to communicate with. But it was really useful to have practical examples to kind of help explain things. And I think we'll hear about that from our colleagues today. But I think ultimately it's also not just about what we're talking about in nexus terms, but why it's important that we promote working from a nexus perspective. So I think we could all agree that even in Australia, it's difficult to work and bring together different people within a sector. It's difficult to get people from different disciplines and backgrounds working together. And that's no different in our partner countries where we work internationally. And it can obviously be hard to make connections across different resource sectors. So I think Australia's benefit is that as a donor, Australia has the opportunity to create space for those connections to occur. And I don't think we should underemphasize how important that can be. So I think my first challenge is, how do we communicate the Nexus concept to others in a meaningful way? The second point I want to make is around the dimensions of the Nexus. So I think taking a Nexus approach helps us understand the complex and dynamic links between different sectors or resources, and recognize that decisions that are made about one will often affect the others. So as an example from work in ACR-STIP, several, within the ACR program, we worked in the northeast of India, the northwest of Bangladesh, and the east of Nepal, in an area called the Eastern Gangetic Plains. And different pieces of work looked at the connections between groundwater, energy, and food in West Bengal. So in 2011, there were major changes made to energy and water policy in West Bengal that made it easier for farmers to access electricity for irrigation. And what was assumed would happen, as it had happened in other parts of India and in other places, farmers would access more groundwater, intensify and diversify their agricultural production. But in a study by the International Water Management Institute that looked at what had happened since 2011, they found that while the number of electric pumps had tripled in West Bengal in that time, there was actually no noticeable change in production at a state level. And one of the explanations from both farmers and policy level was that there were other factors that constrained development. So it wasn't as simple as just making water more easily available. And one of the key ones, or a couple of key issues, were in terms of rising input costs and stagnant returns. So in the northeast of India, the farmers don't have access to as much access to minimum support prices, for example, as farmers in the west and south of India. And so there was just less incentive to change their production patterns, even with easier access to water. So in this case, you can't just focus on water and energy even alone. The food procurement side there was lacking, so the food and agriculture policies are also important to consider. And I think we also have to acknowledge that although we're talking today about water, energy and food, there are other dimensions that might be more or equally as important to our partners. So for example, in the literature or in discussions, you might hear about energy, water, water, energy, biodiversity, water, energy, land, climate, land, energy, water nexus. So there's no kind of shortage of different dimensions, but it's really about the connections and promoting transdisciplinary approaches to research and development. So I think another challenge is, how do we define the most critical elements of the nexus to make the approach more relevant for others? And the third issue is, I think, the importance of considering scale when we think about Nexus. So I think the first image we often have when we think about this is we might think about hydropower and what are the trade-offs for energy and irrigation, for example, and the environment. And while higher level policy and development decisions and settings do impact the Nexus, of course, the decisions that people make, so households or farmers make on a daily or seasonal basis, can also impact on what happens. So I think we can recognise that at the household level, managing household level food, energy and water security is literally a daily occurrence for most households, and it's often and that is often managed by women. So again, highlighting that gender is critical in these different considerations. Another example from ACR-STIP is that in the Eastern Gangetic Plains, we tested and promoted conservation agriculture-based sustainable intensification. And from those large-scale field trials, what we know is that those farming approaches do save time, water, and energy, and they also increase productivity and profitability. And so this was a way that we could very easily or clearly demonstrate the kind of farm level food, energy, water nexus, so that it's empowering farmers to balance that nexus. And so, as I said, you know, those decisions are being made on a daily or seasonal basis. And so although they are kind of smaller decision-making units, when they add up to quite a lot when there are hundreds of millions of people making those decisions on a daily or seasonal basis. And I think the other thing to think about in terms of scale is that there are challenges of matching kind of institutional and administrative settings with biophysical systems. And there are very variable decision-making and planning timeframes that exist or that are in play. And so even within a sector, you might have different planning sessions depending on whether you're at a different governmental level, for example. So all of those things kind of come into play and are really important when you think about the interactions between different sectors. So I think, again, what is the challenge for us is how do we identify the scale issues that are important in managing the nexus? So they're just kind of my kind of first responses to thinking about how we think about the nexus. And as we go through the session, so the format of the session will be initial presentations from three of our colleagues to illustrate how they've worked within a nexus framework in different locations and at different scales. And that's really to stimulate our thinking. So we'll hear those presentations in a row and have time later. Following that, we'll break into small groups to consider some key questions about how we operationalise the nexus. And then if we have time, given we're running a bit late, we'll spend the final part of the session with a panel discussion so that we hope that those small group discussions can generate some reflections and also probably, if you're anything like the four of us, some more questions that you might have and we can reflect on those. So I'm going to hand over to Caroline now to give her presentation. Thanks, Caroline.
Hi, everyone. Okay, and this is my clicker. Can I just click this button? Okay, cool. Nice to see you all. I'm a bit nervous. This is my first speaking event in 2 years. Feels a bit 3D. Today, I just want to talk to you about FAO, the work we do, our programs, and some of the ways we like to think about the Nexus and some of the ways we like to approach the Nexus. Now, for anyone that's not familiar with FAO's work, our main target audience in all our programs are national governments. All our partnerships with the national governments, all our networks are designed to engage the national governments. And so the way that we work is taking ideas to practice, pilots to strategy, and enhancing multidisciplinary approaches across all of our programs. Is it? The green one or this one? Okay. It's weird, so I've pressed really hard. Okay, so our three programs are the Next Gen program, the Water Scarcity program, and our GEF program. Now, our Next Gen program is the program that we run with AWP, and this is essentially a pilot type project or a proof of concept program that we run with AWP. Now, within the Next Gen project, the Next Gen program was designed specifically to facilitate multidisciplinary approaches. Now, we had three programs under the Next Gen program. The first was irrigation benchmarking, the second was fish and biodiversity in irrigation schemes, and the third was gender and water management. And we've actually been able to find some really, really beautiful synergies between our gender program and our fish and biodiversity program. And we are currently working on a case study between the two programs to look at the different way gender dynamics impact fisheries, water management, water engagement with gender, so on and so forth. Now, the question that we like to ask at FAO is, now what? When the program finishes, when we have established that these are the synergies that exist, what are we going to do about it? And within that, we have our water scarcity program. Now, the aim of the water scarcity program is to find a way to institutionalize Nexus approaches. Because while we have all these great reports and these great approaches and this great thinking and these great workshops, when we walk away from these workshops, what happens? What happens when the program ends? So how do we institutionalize that into government, once we have established what is happening. And that's where the real challenge occurs, because while we work within the Nexus, this is really what the Nexus looks like in a broader scale. You know, the water, energy, food Nexus is a really nice, clean, tidy square that we can work in, but these are the real challenges governments are facing. And how do we help them work on the water, energy, food Nexus while also addressing the multitude of priorities that intersect with water, and also helping them actualize those nexuses? So at the moment in the water scarcity program, we're trying to establish water accounting and allocation, as Louise mentioned previously. And the way that we're doing that is we're trying to establish multidisciplinary teams and a water accounting unit within government. Now, we wrote this really, really beautiful program document, and we had this really, really, really beautiful plan. And I came last week to, you know, operationalizing it. And I was like, okay, so how do we do this? Do we just write the government a nice email and say, do you want to work together? We've got this really nice report. This is what you're going to do. This is how you're going to go about it. No, that's never going to work. So how do we get a government to work together that doesn't even have a data sharing agreement, that doesn't even have internal committees already that are working together and trying to establish that? So that's the step one of where we are at FAO at the moment, is that how do we help governments and lead with them to create kind of Nexus approaches for many different issues across the water spectrum? Now, of course, then we get to our transboundary projects. And Nexus challenges are magnified in the transboundary project, in the transboundary context. You know, we start with really basic projects in the transboundary context, and we think that we're talking about a water issue, and we come to a meeting and the military actually comes to talk with us, because the transboundary project is often a security concern for many countries, you know, and the amount of blocks in place to stop people from working together or collaborating just within the security element is extremely challenging. So I leave you today with lots of questions, I guess, and that is the key takeaway that I would like everyone to think about, is that once we've written our project document, once we have implemented our project, once we have a really good report, once we have a really good understanding of what is happening, and we've got a few government people to the table, is how do we then start to institutionalize this change? How do we help governments and lead them the way to working together, to establishing units that are multidisciplinary? And that's what I hope we can talk about today. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a better understanding of how FAO works, and I hope that I've raised some questions, and hopefully we can talk about those today. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm going to pass over to Federico now to give his experiences on an approach to apply the water, energy, food nexus when addressing agriculture and water issues in the Pacific. Thank you, Federico. This one.
Thanks everyone for joining. Yes, same as you, Caroline. This is the first time I think I've engaged with people publicly since April 2020. So excited and nervous at the same time. My reflections on the water, food, energy nexus stem from working in the Pacific Islands through a range of research projects. So my perspective comes from a research lens, but a very applied research lens. And I've had the opportunity to work largely in the agriculture and food systems space, given that's my area of interest and expertise. But inevitably, this has led to being exposed to the connections between water, food, and energy in a small island context. The work I've conducted has been done in collaboration with NGOs in the Pacific Islands, such as the Pacific Island Farmer Organization Network, which has really allowed me to understand how farmers engage on the day-to-day food production and water management. And the NGOs have really facilitated understanding how those different farming knowledges influence food production systems. Some of the work has also been done with science and technology agencies in the Pacific, in my context, particularly with the Pacific Community, SPC, who over the last few years has really been championing the concept of integration and systems thinking at a regional level to support national governments in the Pacific region to really try and link not just water, agriculture and energy, but also issues of gender and social inclusion, education, with concepts of food security, which are a major issue in the region. So with that context, I will talk about, I guess, three general things about the Pacific Islands region. One is the uniqueness and diversity of the region. The second is what we think we can learn from the diversity of knowledge that exists in the region. And thirdly, some opportunities for us as AWP partners to go forward in the Pacific. So firstly, the map you see is a SPC map on the Pacific region, and it's really to illustrate how enormous the region actually is. It's often conceptualized as small islands, but the Pacific countries are really proud of articulating themselves as large ocean states, given the large economic, exclusive economic zones they have in their countries. And this has created this fairly well accepted concept of the Blue Pacific, which is really owned by governments, but also by communities. And it's part of the Pacific identity that the ocean and the water that connects them is really part of who they are and how they change and related to each other through history before and during colonization. So this concept of the Blue Pacific acts as a really important heuristic for us to engage with the region and really try and understand where they're coming from and how they frame their issues. So with this geographic diversity comes a lot of diversity in the water, food, energy nexus. So this is, I guess, most simply put, in terms of thinking of the Pacific in terms of geographic regions. So we've got the general sort of Melanesian countries, the Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, which are quite high islands, quite a lot of fresh water and rainwater, quite productive agriculture systems. Then you've got your Polynesian countries like Samoa and Tonga, which have relatively productive agriculture, but some slightly more challenging food production conditions and water contexts. And then you've got the North Pacific and particularly Micronesian atoll islands, which face fairly extreme water and food production contexts, which means they are largely import dependent for their food. And climate projections indicate that these atoll countries are going to be profoundly accepted and transformed. So it raises some really important questions around how food and water are managed on land that is vanishing. The water food nexus is the water food energy nexus is actually, I think, quite different in the Pacific than in other parts of the world. Part of it is the scale in which the nexus operates. And some of the work we've been doing with the Australian Water Partnership has been trying to understand how public policy across the Pacific is conceptualizing the water food energy nexus. Now, it's not a nexus talk without a diagram. Thanks, Caroline, for diagram number one. I'm doing diagram number two. What we've essentially really found in looking at agriculture sector plans and water sector plans and trying to understand how these different institutions can come together to deal with the nexus in the Pacific is that there's essentially three types of links. One relates to the competition between resources. The second relates to the impacts of climate change and essentially how that influences agricultural practices. And the third one, which is really prevalent, is how farming practices are drivers of water consumption and changing ecosystems. And one thing I guess we found from looking at these policies is that there seems to be quite a lot more attention paid to the agriculture sector, and agriculture sector policies explicitly say how the agriculture sector can be responsible for sustainably managing water resources. Water sector plans in the Pacific, we've found, tend to be quite out of date and not as current as agriculture ones. And we find the water sector to be quite fragmented in terms of resource management versus WASH. There's very little integration on that space, which makes it even more complex to integrate to the agriculture space. The context of agriculture is also really important. A lot of agriculture in the Pacific is rain-fed. There's very, very little to no irrigation. Water is managed often by communities, so there's no real sort of water allocation, water monitoring system. So it's really difficult to understand how water is being used in the region. And you've noticed I haven't really mentioned energy in this diagram, and that's partially because we've found that energy is often dealt with quite differently and is really not part of the Nexus conversations. Nexus conversations are really hard to have. They are there and they're being enabled by agencies like SPC or some of the NGOs. Energy in the water food context in the Pacific is largely linked to transport and the energy to move food throughout this enormous region and for people being able to access food. Energy is not really related to large hydropower systems, which are the ones we're familiar with in terms of thinking about the Nexus in the Mekong region. But very importantly, energy does come in a different, I guess, very different lens in the Pacific, which is human energy and human labor, because a lot of agriculture and water collection in the Pacific is still very human driven. There's very little, I guess, infrastructure and technology. So I think in the Pacific, working in the water food energy nexus really requires us to shift and expand our thinking of what energy really entails. So what can we learn from this quite diverse and amazing region? I think one thing that's quite interesting, and it reflects some of the comments this morning from the ambassador, is how important climate change is to the future and to the inevitable transformation of society and ecosystems in the Pacific region. And climate change is in the everyday social awareness of the region, from the most rural, remote communities to your urban centers that are being heavily impacted by cyclones and floods. It's almost impossible to have a meeting with Pacific colleagues without talking about climate change. And I think that actually creates a really important opportunity for us as partners to really work in a very real high understanding of climate change in a region that is being rapidly affected and transformed by this. This then gives us a lot of opportunity to work with our expertise here in Australia and combine it with the Pacific expertise on their everyday exposures and living with climate change to try and find solutions for that transformation. And another opportunity I see in the Pacific is how natural resources are governed and therefore how climate solutions are governed. And we have found through our work and relationships with partners that there's almost two levels of governance operating at the same time. There's your national infrastructure, which has the Nexus policies and the infrastructure that, I guess, donors work with. But then there's community level governance, and that's quite unique in the Pacific because it's very attached to issues of land tenure, and that influences natural resource ownership. And the national and community governance systems really operate in parallel, and sometimes they don't talk to each other. So communities have very deep traditional ways of governing their resources, which are still very much alive. And the national governments have their, I guess, more westernized infrastructure for governing the resources. So working in these two, I guess, levels might offer opportunities for us to think quite creatively around how we work at different scales in the water food nexus. Now, and then moving to some opportunities from what we can learn in some of these, this specific uniqueness. One really, really big thing is how we think about data, both quantitative and qualitative, and how it's integrated in a water food energy context. A lot of people assume that there's no data on the Pacific. I actually think that's wrong. There's a lot of Pacific data, and there's a long history of both Western and Pacific science that has documented aspects of the water for energy nexus. There's a lot of studies. NGOs through history have done a lot of work. USP, the University of South Pacific, has a lot of quite great academics in the region. Part of this data is that it hasn't really been put within a bigger picture, sustainable development, or sort of bigger resilience framework. So one big, quite important job is really looking at all these different water, food studies that have happened and really start putting them together and working from the fairly extensive databases that do exist throughout the region to start getting a more systemic picture of the water, food, energy nexus in the region. And I guess another opportunity to leave you with is that there's quite a lot of positive energy despite the challenging climate context of the region. The governments, communities, NGOs, despite these challenges, have a very strong positive lens about the future. And it's quite important to draw from this sort of future-oriented narrative that the countries have. Capacity can be a challenge. There's actually quite a lot of resources in the region, but part of it is enabling the countries to deal with those resources given the limited human capacity. There's quite a lot of, there's some technical capacity within governments and science organizations. It's about trying to understand how the resources can be integrated and better coordinated to really try and maximize the capacity that exists. So hopefully that's given you a general overview of how complex, but also how exciting the Pacific region is. And yeah, happy to take any questions and also talk over the next 2 days about the Pacific. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Federico. I think that was really interesting. It's a kind of completely different perspective to Caroline's, but also there are some reinforcing messages coming through there too. I'll now pass over to Darabi. Well, actually, we've got a pre-recorded presentation from Darabi Kiev, although she's joining us online. So we'll play that presentation now. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara, for giving the opportunity for me to present today. My name is Darabi Kiev. I am the Operations and Maintenance Coordinator, formerly working for CABA program, and now I'm moving to the Mekong Water Solutions. And today, I would like to present about my 12-year experience working in irrigation operation maintenance at the CABA program, that is an Australian-funded program in Cambodia. So before moving on to what CABA is, so I would like to introduce why we have been working on the irrigation development and management. Here is the picture that show how difficult farmers have to go through before the irrigation development. They either have limited access to water, or they are accessing to the water supplies, but they have to use or spend a lot of money on pumping costs, where they use a lot of very low inefficient pump, individual pumping. And a farmer could do only one crop, and the road access is very difficult. So these are the issues that farmers are facing, and CABA are investing in irrigation development and also provided training to farmers through our completion schemes by installing high efficient electrical pump, a central pump, and providing all the sufficient infrastructure like the main canals, secondary canal, tertiary canal, and all the drainage. And that's our 10 years of work that have been finally recognized by the Prime Minister, that he paid a visit in 2019 with the Australian ambassador in Cambodia to see how it affects farmer life, the positive impacts. And these are the snapshots and a very brief of the benefits that have been provided to farmers through our program. So we provided the irrigation infrastructure and the road access, because on the embankment, farmer can enjoy the road access, and it has been difficult in many parts of the country. Secondly, is the profitable. Farmer could do only one crop, and now they can do 2 to 3 crops per year, which means they can increase their income. And it's also our irrigation has been modernized and provided more easy access for all, but especially for women and children. They can go and take out the pipe from the canals and irrigate that farm. Before, they used to spend a lot of time out in the field. That's why after our irrigation system, this provided more time for the family, especially for women, so that they can earn extra income through their time that they used to spend out in the field. And the kids now doesn't have to spend more time to have their family, and they can go to school. There are also some part of the irrigation systems that farmer can enjoy other benefits, like the electricity connection to household. Electricity connections to household in Cambodia is not widely available, especially in the remote area. And among our irrigation system, there are a few that haven't been connected to electricity until we construct the pumping stations and connect the electricity poles there, and farmer requested to enjoy the benefits, and that is very good for their household. And there are many other more stories to come. This is a few links that I provided in my presentation here, where you can see men and women have benefited from the irrigation systems. And there's a story about the women who have joined the farming community, and she now can enjoy some more benefits of that. So yeah. Before going to this is where I mentioned earlier what program of our program is. COVA is an Australian funded program working on agriculture and irrigation, and where I'm working on is on irrigation development. And so far we have constructed about 30 irrigation systems and 15 electrical pumping stations to ensure that we provide more secure water source and a highly efficient pump, reduce a lot of pumping costs for farmers. Like 1/3 at 2/3 have been reduced, so they spend about 1/3 of the price they used to. And we provide a complete scheme so that farmer can operate and irrigate more. And if that service provided, farmer can are willing to pay to ensure that the sustainability is there after the program completed. They can take it on board and do it by themselves without our support. So we are the first and the only program that provide long support on operation and maintenance to ensure the sustainability. So we have been doing differently. Normally, most of the program doing the designs and constructions and provide only 6 months or 1 year at most to establish a farming community. They call FWUC, Farmer Water User Community. But for us, we do it different. We provided more 2 to 3 years after the construction. So the total of our construction is about and provide the support about 5 to 6 years, which no program only 2 to 3 years at most. And what we do differently is also we select the farmers from the farm to elect out of the farmers, elect among themselves who they want to be the leader in that community. And we go through the process, and it takes longer time, but we find that it's very efficient. The farmer choose whoever they want, the majority will vote for that person. And after the constructions, we provide 2 to 3 years on the pumping and operation of the schemes, and we include the technology so that farmers can use their phone or TV expecting who get water and who not. And all of these have been provided over the years and updated according to the technologies that we are updating nowadays. And one of the crucial part of the community management is the financial management. So we provided all the bookkeepings, all the financial support, and it takes 2 to 3 years as well. And right now we are integrating to improve the transparency of the program by having a farmer pay by mobile banking. Before they only use cash, but cash can be an issue when it's a large amount, and carry the cash around is not secure. So now we are trying to introduce this, and farmer enjoying the paying by the mobile payment or at the agent, as you can see on the top right. And what we gain from farmer trust is after the collection of the money, these have to be used more efficiently and respond to their needs. So what farmer need the most is the road maintenance, and we provide the training so that the community saving the money for emergency to maintain the whole infrastructure, the pumps itself, the canals, and other infrastructure. Although we provide a lot of support, but we're still facing the constraints. These are the main constraints that we are facing. We are afraid that after we complete, that will be the constraint that may have hindered the sustainability of the community. One is on the political interference, because the political climate here is so complicated and difficult, and the decrease in paddy price, the increased production cost. For example, right now the fertilizer and the pesticide have increased a lot, and farmers spend a lot of money on that. And if it's too too high, farmers are not going to make any profit. And some of the schemes that we are providing have been only half a year left, so we are afraid that it's not enough for them to take on board without our training and the lack of skill and expertise that farmers are having because limited knowledge. Most of the, if not all, the farming community, we select the highest education they get is finish high school, and a lot is lower than that. So we are afraid that they're going to take up the new technology and everything. So we now working on the public-private partnership in irrigation, because if it's going to go ahead, it's now in the progress. It's one of the first in the country, and the PPP law has just passed in late last year, in November last year. So we are now in the progress of taking that step. We work with different stakeholders in this. So we have been working with the Ministry of Economy and Finance. We're working with the government of Cambodia on the Water Resources and Meteorology Ministry. And we are looking for the company on that will take on our work as a operator, operation maintenance lease operator. And farming community are still there as a representative of farming, and our farmer are the end users that are enjoying the benefit that they are receiving now. And this work is in a hope for improving services that they are doing with the mechanizations and all the agricultural extension services, and also connecting them with a private company would ensure that their produce are bought and exported to the international markets. The post-harvesting is highly recognized now to the EU market, and looking for more. I think this is a snapshot of my presentation today, and thank you. If you have any questions, please go on. Thank you.
Or it demonstrates, yeah, that the kind of wider network that sits around, I guess, any intervention, but including anything that is the food, energy, water nexus, and how important that structure is, that to have a structure that supports the system, and also critically balancing the needs of the different stakeholders was really well illustrated there. Our online participants will leave us now, and then we're going to move into some small group discussions. So thanks to all participants for joining us today.